The first night in the hostel felt like stepping into a world that belonged entirely to strangers. My suitcase rattled behind me as I dragged it down the dim corridor, the overhead lights buzzing faintly as though unsure of their duty. The air carried the scent of detergent mixed with something rawer, sweat, nerves, youth packed together in tight rooms. I found the door marked with my assigned number and hesitated, my palm lingering on the knob. A quiet anticipation stirred in me. This was the threshold between what I had always known and what I could not yet imagine. Inside, the room was already half claimed. 2 beds were unmade, clothes slung carelessly across chairs, and a faint trace of cologne hovered in the air. The first to notice me was Ethan. He sat cross-legged on his mattress, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth as if he had been expecting me all along. His hair fell slightly over his forehead, and his voice, when he greeted me, was warm but edged with something teasing, as though he enjoyed measuring people with quick, light jabs. "That must make you the third," Ethan said, pushing himself up on his elbows. "We were starting to think you'd bailed." Before I could answer, another voice came from the far side of the room. Caleb looked up from a book resting on his lap. His expression was calm, steady, and yet his eyes held a kind of intensity that unsettled me. Where Ethan's energy bounced outward, Caleb seemed to draw everything inward, as if he weighed each moment before allowing himself to participate. "I told you he'd come," Caleb said quietly, marking his page with deliberate care that I introduced myself, setting my suitcase near the last empty bed. Ethan was quick to break the stiffness of introductions, tossing questions at me as though we were already old friends: where I was from, what I planned to study, whether I had ever lived away from home before. Caleb listened more than he spoke, but whenever he did offer words, they seemed to land with weight. As the evening wore on, we talked in broken strands, each revealing just enough to give shape to who we were. I learned Ethan had a knack for turning the mundane into a joke, his sarcasm sliding easily into conversation. Caleb, in contrast, carried a stillness that demanded attention. He spoke sparingly, but I noticed Ethan always glanced at him after delivering a quip, as though seeking his silent approval. The dynamic between them fascinated me. At times, they seemed like opposites unwillingly tethered together, but then a small exchange, a shared smirk, a knowing glance, suggested an intimacy built over time. I felt like an intruder in a story that had already been unfolding before my arrival. When the lights in the hallway dimmed, our own room settled into a softer rhythm. Ethan sprawled across his bed, talking about campus rumors and making predictions about which professors would be unbearable. Caleb sat at his desk, scribbling notes with a mechanical precision that seemed almost ritualistic. I alternated between listening to Ethan's stream of words and catching the subtle shifts in Caleb's expression whenever Ethan pushed a joke too far. At one point, Ethan leaned toward me with a conspiratorial grin. "Word of advice," he said, lowering his voice. "Don't let Caleb fool you. He looks serious, but he's got secrets." Caleb didn't look up, though a faint flicker of irritation crossed his features. "Ignore him," he murmured. "He thinks everyone's a puzzle to solve." Their exchange left me both amused and unsettled. I couldn't tell if Ethan's words were meant as a joke or if he was hinting at something truer than he let on. As the night deepened, conversation dwindled into silence. The hum of the ceiling fan filled the room. I lay in my bed, staring at the shadows that stretched across the ceiling, trying to absorb the strangeness of my new reality. Across from me, Ethan's breathing grew steady, the rhythm of someone accustomed to sleep arriving quickly. Caleb remained awake longer, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of his desk lamp. I watched him close his book with deliberate care, place it on the nightstand, and finally stretch out under the covers. Just before he turned off the lamp, his eyes flickered toward me. It was a brief glance, almost accidental, yet it lingered in my thoughts. There was nothing overt in it, no smile, no expression, but something in that moment felt charged, like a secret had brushed against me before vanishing. Lying there, I couldn't shake the sense that I had stepped into something larger than myself. These two strangers were not just strangers anymore, they were companions bound to me by circumstance, and perhaps something more. I felt both curious and cautious, caught between Ethan's easy charm and Caleb's quiet gravity. The air grew cooler as the night wore on, the silence heavy with what remained unsaid. I closed my eyes, letting the rhythm of the room pull me towards sleep, yet the thought lingered. The first night had barely begun, and already, something within me had shifted. The first morning in the hostel arrived with an unfamiliar chorus, doors slamming, showers running, voices calling across the hallway. I stirred from uneasy sleep, disoriented by the narrow bed and the presence of two other bodies breathing within the same four walls. Ethan was already awake, humming tunelessly as he rummaged through his duffel bag. He tossed shirts onto his bed as if searching for something that refused to be found. Caleb, in contrast, moved quietly, folding his blanket with neat precision before reaching for the book he had abandoned the night before. Ethan grinned when he noticed me sitting up. "Morning, rookie. Survived the first night?" His tone was teasing, yet something in his eyes invited camaraderie, as though he was already determined to make me a part of their small circle. Caleb didn't look up from his pages. "You'll get used to it," he said evenly, though the faint curve of his mouth suggested a restrained kindness. The day unfolded in fragments: breakfast in a noisy mess hall, hurried walks across campus, introductions to professors whose names blurred together. Yet through it all, I found myself acutely aware of Ethan and Caleb. Ethan thrived in every space, shaking hands, making jokes that drew laughter even from strangers. Caleb, meanwhile, observed from the edges, offering his words sparingly but always with clarity, as if he spoke only when silence could no longer suffice. By the time evening returned, the three of us had begun to form a rhythm. Ethan was the spark, igniting conversation without effort. Caleb was the anchor, steadying the current whenever it threatened to drift too far. I hovered between them, drawn in by the gravity of their dynamic. Later that night, we gathered in the room again, each of us weary but unwilling to retreat into silence. Ethan sprawled across his bed, recounting stories of his hometown with a mix of exaggeration and wit. Caleb sat at his desk, half listening while making notes in a worn notebook. I leaned back against the headboard of my bed, watching the exchange as though witnessing a play rehearsed many times before. When Ethan joked about how Caleb had probably been a star student who never broke a rule in his life, Caleb finally set his pen down. "You talk too much, Ethan," he said calmly. But his eyes betrayed a flicker of irritation that quickly dissolved into something softer. Ethan laughed, unfazed, as though provoking that response was his goal all along. That I sensed something deeper in their exchange, something layered beneath casual banter. The way Ethan's gaze lingered on Caleb, the way Caleb's voice shifted when addressing him, it hinted at familiarity that carried both comfort and tension. I felt a tug of curiosity, the desire to know what history they shared, what truths remained unspoken between them. Over the following days, small moments began to accumulate. Once, I caught Ethan brushing Caleb's arm lightly as he passed, the touch fleeting yet deliberate. Another time, late at night, I heard them whispering in the dark while they assumed I was asleep. Their words were indistinct, but the cadence carried intimacy, like a language meant only for two. One evening, during a lull in conversation, I asked Caleb about the photograph taped inside his notebook. He closed it quickly, but not before I saw the faint outline of another boy smiling from the picture. "That's Ryan," he said after a pause, his voice carefully measured. "We've been together a while. He's far away." Ethan smirked at the mention of the name, though his eyes glinted with something sharper than amusement. "Caleb and his long-distance fairy tale," he said. "You should hear how often he checks his phone, waiting for messages that never come." Caleb's jaw tightened, though he remained silent. The air in the room shifted, heavy with words unspoken. I realized then that their closeness was not simple friendship, it was threaded with complexities I could not yet fully grasp. Later that week, after lights out, Ethan suggested a game of truth or dare, his grin mischievous in the dim glow of the desk lamp. At first, it felt harmless, questions about favorite foods, embarrassing childhood stories. But gradually the dares grew bolder, the truths more personal. Ethan thrived in attention, daring Caleb to reveal details he resisted, pressing me to confess things I would not have shared otherwise. When the lamp finally flicked off, I lay awake, unsettled by the undercurrents swirling in the room. My thoughts circled back to Caleb's guarded expression, Ethan's relentless teasing, and the strange pull I felt toward them both. It was as though I had been drawn into their orbit, unable to escape the gravity of their unspoken bond. The nights grew cooler as the week wore on. One evening, when the hallway had fallen silent, I found myself speaking with Caleb in hushed tones while Ethan slept. He told me about Ryan, about the distance, the missed calls, the promises stretched thin. His words carried a weight that revealed more than he intended, and for a moment, I felt his vulnerability as though it were my own. His eyes softened when he looked at me, and I wondered if he had forgotten that Ethan lay only a few feet away. The following day, Ethan cornered me when Caleb was out. "Don't read too much into what he says," he warned, his grin playful but his eyes serious. "Caleb likes to sound tragic. It's his thing." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Besides, he's not as untouchable as he looks." The remark lingered with me long after Caleb returned. Ethan's words had been casual, but they carried an edge, as though he was daring me to see beyond Caleb's careful facade. That night, as the three of us settled into our beds, the room hummed with a strange tension. I could feel the weight of unspoken truths pressing down, shaping the air we breathed. Ethan lay in the dark, his laughter softer now, fading into silence. Caleb shifted beneath his blanket, his breath steady but heavy with restraint. That I closed my eyes, aware that something fragile was forming between us, something neither friendship nor rivalry could define. The boundaries had not yet broken, but they trembled beneath the strain, and in that trembling silence, I knew the first line had already been drawn. The storm arrived without warning. Thunder rolled across the campus, rattling the windows of our room as rain lashed against the glass in relentless sheets. The power flickered, then steadied, casting our faces in a faint, uneasy glow. Ethan sat up, grinning as though the storm had been staged for his amusement. Caleb, however, drew his blanket tighter, his eyes fixed on the shifting patterns of shadow that crawled across the ceiling. That we had been restless all evening, conversation dwindling into a silence broken only by the storm. Ethan leaned back on his elbows, his voice carrying above the rain. "Guess the universe wants us trapped together tonight." His grin was playful, but the words carried weight, as if he relished the idea of confinement. That I glanced at Caleb, who gave no response. Yet something in his stillness felt charged, as though he were holding back more than words. Ethan shifted, moving closer to the center of the room. His presence filled the space with ease, every gesture deliberate. "We could sit here in silence," he said, "or we could actually do something." His eyes gleamed, daring either of us to object. Caleb sighed, shaking his head. "You never know when to stop." "Maybe," Ethan said softly, "but sometimes stopping is the mistake." His gaze lingered on Caleb, then flicked briefly toward me. The air thickened, heavy with meanings no one dared name. Minutes passed, the storm outside echoing the turmoil within. My chest tightened as Ethan leaned closer, his hand brushing mine under the guise of reaching for something on the floor. The touch was fleeting, but it burned like fire against my skin. I caught Caleb watching, his jaw tense, his expression unreadable. The silence cracked when Ethan laughed lightly, as though mocking his own boldness. "See? No harm in breaking the ice." Yet beneath his grin lay something sharper, something deliberate. Caleb rose suddenly, crossing the room to stand near the window. He stared out into the darkness, rain sliding down the glass like unspoken words. "You think everything's a game," he muttered. His voice was low, but I heard the strain beneath it. Ethan followed him with his eyes, the grin fading into something quieter. "Not everything," he said. "Just the parts worth risking." I felt the pull between them like a current I could not resist. Their words danced on the edge of confession, every syllable weighted with history I could not claim but was being drawn into. When Caleb turned back, his eyes found mine. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to still. His gaze was unguarded, filled with conflict and a fragile longing he could no longer hide. My breath caught, and I knew the line we had skirted for days was about to break. Ethan moved first. He closed the distance between us, his hand brushing my shoulder, his presence overwhelming. His touch was not accidental this time, it lingered, daring me to step back. I didn't. Caleb's eyes darkened with something I could not name, anger, desire, fear, perhaps all at once. He took a step forward, then paused, torn between resistance and surrender. "Ethan," he warned, his voice breaking slightly, but Ethan only smiled, his hands sliding lower, his eyes locked on Caleb rather than me. "You don't get to keep pretending," he whispered. "Not anymore." The tension shattered. Caleb closed the gap, his movements abrupt, as if pulled by a force stronger than his will. The three of us stood in the narrow space between beds, the storm outside roaring its approval. Ethan's arm brushed against mine, Caleb's breath grazed my cheek, and suddenly the air was electric, unbearable. It happened in fragments, touches, glances, unspoken choices collapsing into action. Ethan's boldness ignited the moment, but Caleb's surrender gave it weight. My body moved almost without thought, caught between them, complicit in the breaking of boundaries we had all silently acknowledged but never crossed. For a time, the world narrowed to the storm inside the room, the warmth of skin, the clash of restraint and desire, the tangled blur of Ethan's recklessness and Caleb's reluctant hunger. Guilt wove itself into the fabric of every touch, yet it only heightened the urgency, as though the knowledge of betrayal made the moment burn brighter. When silence finally reclaimed us, the storm outside had quieted to a steady rain. The room was still, but its atmosphere had irrevocably changed. Ethan leaned back against the wall, satisfied, his grin tempered but triumphant. Caleb sat on the edge of his bed, his face buried in his hands, shoulders tense with regret that I lay in the middle of it all, my heartbeat unsteady, the reality of what we had done pressing heavily against my chest. No words came, there was nothing safe to say. After a long silence, Caleb spoke, his voice raw. "Ryan doesn't deserve this." His confession hung in the air, fragile and damning. Ethan scoffed lightly, though his eyes softened. "Ryan's not here. We are." Caleb's head snapped up, his glare sharp. "That doesn't make it right." The storm outside had weakened, but inside the room, another storm brewed, quieter but far more dangerous. I felt caught between them, tethered to both by threads I hadn't chosen but could no longer deny. When dawn approached, none of us had slept. Caleb dressed quickly, avoiding our eyes as he left for an early class. Ethan stretched lazily, as though nothing had happened, tossing a careless remark about breakfast before following him out. That I remained alone, the silence of the room deafening. The bed still carried the weight of what had transpired, the air heavy with secrets that could never be undone. That I knew the night had changed everything. What had begun as curiosity had turned into complicity, and the fragile trust between us now hung by a thread. Whether the bond would hold or unravel was uncertain, but one truth was clear: we had crossed a line, and there was no return.